glad you had closed captioning. All right, so we're in Luke 16. And we're going to look at the first 13 verses of 16. So I'll read. All right. He, being Jesus, also said to the disciples, "There is a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world, or sons of light, depending on your translation, are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Sons of this world, or darkness, are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous mammon, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." All right. So this parable, I think, is pretty much agreed upon by most scholars as being the most difficult parable in the Gospels. And I want to share with you what I think is the best way to read it. All right, so what are some complications we have just reading this thing at face value?
I don't understand the whole thing about him canceling and minimizing people's debts and why that's like what the purpose is and how that's helping and
Okay.
why that's acting shrewd and stuff.
Fair? Is that a fair assessment of what you just said? Okay. What else?
In verse 2, it seems that the rich man is getting rid of the manager without actually trying to verify the accusations against him.
Okay.
I'd like to understand.
Me too.
I don't know how it's written in other people's translations, but the first verse in 9 says charges were brought to him that his manager was squandering his resources. And I guess I'd like to what does it mean that he was squandering the resources?
It says wasting possession.
Wasting possessions?
What else? I think there's bigger problems in this story at face value than just these.
The God versus money, maybe? I don't know
Okay.
how to pose it, but one or the other.
Um,
I'm gonna write mammon
Okay.
because that is the word that's used. Our translators want to interpret the text for us a little bit, and they chose to write money, but the word is mammon, which is not the typical word used for money. And in
another-
some translations, it'll even be capitalized, the word mammon.
What does it say? Like verse 8, where it's talking about the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light. It makes it sound like a good thing, but I wouldn't think that, and I don't know what it even means when it says that. Like shrewd in what way? And then verse 9, I don't understand it all either. Make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth. So then when it is gone, they may welcome you into eternal homes. Like, that's like, I'm still, like, there's so much about this parable that doesn't even, like, make any sort of sense to me.
It would be helpful for verse 9 to determine who was, and I tell you, who was actually saying that. The quote's a little off. I can't really, the quoting, double and single quotes. Dan says it's a tough one.
I think I assume this was where Ashley was going with the first one, was like, why would the manager or the owner or whatever reward the manager for basically reducing the debt that people owe him? So like that part doesn't seem to make sense. Like why would somebody be like, yay, you just lost me some stuff.
All right, well, keep thinking of those, and if one jumps out to you while we're talking that you want to add to that list, we can. But the next thing I want to do is, who are the characters in this story? While you think about that, I'm going to grab another marker. All right, who are the characters?
The master, the manager, and the debtors.
Mm.
Okay. And what can we surmise that when we think about who these might be analogous to? The master is who in the story?
I was going to say it was us.
So you're saying the master is us. Okay. Anyone else? Anything else?
I don't know. I would think that we're the manager, or we're supposed to be the manager, or at the end it makes it sound like that's what we should be acting like.
Okay.
I think the master is Torah.
And then maybe the debtors, or like people who trespass against us or like other people. I don't know.
Anything else? No one thinks that the rich man's God?
Uh,
I think that's how I've typically been taught this passage.
Does Mammon count as a character too?
Could.
I don't even know what mammon is.
Sorry. All right, so how have you guys heard this taught?
I'm not sure. I've heard it taught.
Yeah, a lot of people just avoid this parable because it's hard.
Are there any other variations of it?
It is only told in this gospel.
So I feel like, you know, like as we were reading it through, I was just like, dang, this doesn't make any sense. But I feel like I've been taught this before in a church setting. It was very simplified, but
But when I teach it, if you agree with it, then they were right, whoever taught that, or it was me that taught it. All right, so let's do this. When we talk about debtors, so in this scene, we have three major characters, right? We have the master or the rich man. We have the steward, and we have the people that owe the master money, the debtors, right? Is that correct? So, Tony,
Dan says, I think we talked about it back last spring. It was a really challenging one to answer, sir.
awesome. Well, good. Maybe that's where you're remembering it from. All right. So, master, manager, debtors. Anyone want to try to tell me, explain what the scene is culturally for this? This is a common three people, right? This is a story that people have lived, know, seen, witnessed, participated in. Master, debtor, steward. What's going on in this setting? Why do they owe him money? Why do they owe the rich man money? Or actually goods, right? Oil and
Monthly goods with interest.
how would we say that that's not possible?
Because interest would be usury. So
Right. Interest is not allowed in Jewish culture. So if the rich man is indeed righteous, he would not have been charging a usury. So what is the scenario?
Is this indentured servitude?
Nope.
Does he own like the general store? You know, because people use
Nope.
things.
It's like just charging interest.
So then maybe it's the rich man who's not doing things right.
Maybe.
Well, the manager's in charge of the rich man's property.
Wait, stop there. The rich man's property. How did you provide for your family?
Farming.
Yeah, you farmed your land. What would happen if you were in debt to someone?
You would farm someone else's land.
No, you'd
Oh,
sell them
yeah.
your land and then farm your own land and pay them from the goods. But in this scenario, we're talking about, I think the wheat I read someplace would feed 110 people for a full year, the amount of wheat that was owed. And the amount of oil that was owed was also a ludicrous amount. Both of the amounts of reduction equal about 500 denarius. And I think a person on average earned 1 denarius a day. I think a denarius is a day's worth of earnings. Okay, so each one was reduced 500 denarius based on what would have been the cost of that day. So the most likely situation is that the master, the rich man, owns a ton of land and he rents it to farmers. And so people farm his land, and for the right to farm his land, they give him a portion of their produce, which eliminates interest and usury. The steward, how many of you have seen the movie 300? Remember the famous scene of kicking the guy?
Yeah.
Because he's like, it's not me, I'm just the speaker for my master, right? The guy that gets kicked into the well. But the reality is, in ancient times, if you were a steward, you what?
You represented, you were the representation.
Right. You are absolutely 100% the representation of the master. So whatever you said was the master's words. So who is the only people that you would ask to be a steward in that setting if you're the rich man?
People you trusted.
Yeah, immensely trusted. Right. So here's the scene. We have a rich man who owns clearly a crap ton of land, right? And we have a steward whose job was to go out and collect the harvests as the payment for renting the land. Somewhere along the lines, we come up with this idea. Reports get back to the rich man that his steward is squandering the money. What do you think that means?
You're responsible for money.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Would it have something to do with the corners of the field and leaving more than the master would probably want, so that you're helping the people, but not the person who technically owns the property and land?
Interesting. Maybe.
Is it taking some for himself?
Yeah, I think that's the most likely, is that when it says that the steward was squandering the money, was meaning basically the steward was showing up with a Rolex, got a new car, all of a sudden the steward was making out better than expected for the job they were doing, right? And so that's why the owner wants to see what? The books. I want to see the books. I want to know what happened. Now, there's something already surprising that happens at that moment when the master says to the steward, you can no longer work for me. I want your books. What's shocking to the audience?
I think the order's wrong.
Okay. What else would be shocking?
The manager doesn't fight it.
That's one. Yeah, the manager basically admits it by just being like, well, and let me just tell you, this part's funny because most likely Jesus is talking to people that are laborers, including his disciples, right? Fishermen. So they were laborers, did hard, grueling work. And he says, I can just imagine, Jesus is like, what am I going to do? I can't dig holes. And everyone there would be like, I spend 12 hours a day digging holes. And this guy is the rich of the rich. Like the steward is wealthy as well, right? The steward is set up pretty nicely. And he's like, I can't dig holes and I'm too proud to beg, right? And so the idea here that's shocking to the audience is, one, that the rich man doesn't immediately lock up the steward for stealing from him. That's shocking. And what does that say about the character? What is Jesus doing, trying to establish about the character of the rich man?
He's merciful.
He's merciful. Even to the point of being generous in his mercy. Instead of putting him in jail, he says, I want to see the books. You can no longer work for me. And seemingly gives the guy time. And so the guy, being shrewd, runs out and reduces the amount owed by 2 of the people. Now, what do you think that is?
My opinion is that he's trying to make good with the other people so that he can get another job with one of them, possibly.
What else?
He's actually making the master look good if everybody's taking his word as the master's word.
Oh,
It looks like the
yeah.
master is being generous and merciful to these debtors.
It's a brilliant move by the steward, because what is the master going to do after the steward's fired? Can the master go back and be like, I fired that guy and the amount he told you is the wrong amount, you actually owe me more?
It's not.
You can't do that. So the steward becomes a hero, because the steward, speaking for the master, will also have his generosity attached to him. And the steward makes the master look generous. And most likely, after a very short period of time, people are already talking about how generous this rich man is for the way that the steward behaved on his behalf.
Is it how generous or how much more generous? Because we already saw he was generous to the manager first.
Yeah, Jesus is definitely building a case here of just upon the generosity of the rich man, right? And so when the rich man hears what he did, what's his response?
Tells him he's clever.
Right, he commends him. He actually says, what you did is good. And then he says something that seems peculiar and hard to wrap our brain around. What is the next part that's hard? I tell you, what is it?
People of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light.
Okay. So now Jesus seems to be making some form of a spiritual statement, right? Wouldn't you agree? He's differentiating between the sons of light and the people of the world. Correct? Yes, no? So let me give you an example. So have you guys seen what happened with Toyota? Toyota was charging higher interest rates to people of color, and they also several other places, and they were forced to pay back like 290 million or something like that to people that with the exact same credit ratings, but their interest rates were higher just based on race. And so Toyota has gone back and is making restitution, right? If, imagine, Toyota, who first ripped off people, were to turn around and offer more money than they took and said, you know what, we feel bad, this was a horrible thing that we did, we're giving 500 million back. What would start to happen about people's opinion of Toyota?
Like it then? Commend them.
Yeah, they would be commended for their shrewdness, right? They would be commended for going above and beyond what they needed to do. And we, you and I, seeing that, would also think it was commendable because it helped so many people, right? So that would be a today example of what's going on here, right? Would we ever say that they shouldn't pay back that amount? Of course not. And would we be upset if they paid back more? So now some people read this section and argue that the amount that was discounted was actually the commission of the steward. And so he decided not to take his commission and therefore was being generous. And that's why the rich man is commending him, because he gave up his financial gain from the situation, which was now made the master look generous. He earns a positive view with the debtors, right? So some make that argument. I don't think that's the case. I think that the argument is that, let me give you something else before we go there. So anybody know what the Essenes were referred to themselves as?
Sons of light.
Sons of light. And the Essenes were what? Can you give a quick description?
They were like a monastic sect that perceived Judaism was essentially corrupt, and they were going to carry out like the proper, pure version of Judaism, like in isolation, independent of the temple, basically. So they kind of had a binary of sons of light, sons of dark, they being the sons of light.
What else did they do? Do you know, like how far did their separation go?
Into the desert caves. Yeah, like complete isolation.
And also, they had their own bank.
That's interesting.
So, and when you moved in, tell me if this doesn't remind you of a story somewhere around, I don't know, Genesis 19, where people, when they entered, would be taken, everything would be taken from them and would be controlled by the community. It would be Sodom and Gomorrah, that's what they're accused of behaving as. And you were not allowed to do any transactions with Sons of Darkness once you became in the scene. All the money was controlled and hoarded only for the good of their community. You could, if you were in a desperate situation, have a transaction with the Son of Darkness, but you could only use cash if you did that. Okay, you were not allowed to barter, you were not allowed to enter into any trade agreements, anything like that with anyone who was not a Sons of Light. Anybody want to take a stab at what it was called, or what the Essenes referred to all of the money and all the business that went on outside of their community?
Mammon?
Unrighteous mammon. Right? And that's in our text. Jesus says the sons of light, and I would argue he's referring to the Essenes, and unrighteous mammon referring to money and therefore almsgiving amongst the people that were not part of the Essenes. Why can we go ahead and make the assumption that it's almsgiving?
Can you repeat the question?
Maybe, probably not verbatim. I'm not even going to try to repeat it because I don't remember. If someone else remembers my exact question, you can go, or Tony can rewind the video. The question is, I'm blank.
Why is it almsgiving?
There you go.
Okay, I missed another question.
One is what?
That's the gist of the
The
question.
unrighteous mammon in this story
Oh,
reference.
because acts of righteousness are almsgiving, so an unrighteous act would be counted.
Okay, but I'm saying it is almsgiving. Jesus is calling it almsgiving here.
The unrighteous act? Oh.
The unrighteous mammon. Got to be careful, not unrighteous act, unrighteous mammon. Therefore, implying that mammon, the dealing of goods, the dealing of money, the transactions of finances, outside of the Essenes were called unrighteous mammon.
He's saying that he's basically slapping the Essenes and saying they're not generous.
They're greedy. They're hoarding money to benefit themselves. And Jesus is saying the unrighteous mammon that you're wagging your finger at is actually what is healthy. Right? What is the passage? Where's the verse that says children of dark versus children of light? That this generation.
For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light.
Okay, so the sons of light. So those outside of the Essene are more shrewd, are more capable of working with each other than the sons of light. What do you think that? If you understand sons of light.
The story is saying that shrewd is commendable or to be commended. So we're going to go with something good. And so the unrighteous mammon, or that not used by the Essenes, in dealing in those that aren't the Essenes dealing within themselves could be commended for the way they're dealing with it. They're doing good with the money.
Okay. So let's take that, Tony. I think that's spot on. So let's take that and think about if we make the shrewd manager an Essene. And at first, when he was squandering, he was doing what?
exploiting?
Yeah, he's keeping the money for himself. He was worried about his own means and taking care of himself. Even though he was a direct vocal and representative of the rich man, who is God in this story, I would argue, right? I think Torah is also spot on, by the way. I would not push back on Torah at all, Mark.
Yeah, there was almost no way there.
And so you have the Essene, who is gathering for themselves, taking care of themselves, and in doing so, who are they not taking care of? Come on, Sunday school answer right here. Who are they not taking care of?
The poor.
Taking care of themselves. Their neighbor,
Oh, yeah.
right? And so their neighbor is left to be destitute, poor. And Jesus says that so this picture would be the master confronts the manager and says, you're my representative in this world, and yet you're hoarding all of the resources. Now, according to Torah, what are you supposed to do with your abundance of resources?
Provide for your neighbor.
Regardless of what?
Everything. Anything. Nothing.
Regardless of whether they're in a scene,
Yeah.
regardless of what faith they follow, regardless of their status, regardless of anything, you are to take care of your neighbor. You are supposed to use your excess resources to care for the community around you. The Essenes couldn't do that. The manager was not doing that. The manager was only focused on wearing that Rolex and pulling up in his Audi, right? That's what the steward had in mind. And God, or Jesus in this instance, telling the story, God's like, that doesn't represent me. That's not who I am. So the shrewd manager, thinking that he's being shrewd, goes out and cuts the debt of people around him. And when he shows up back at the master, or God says, that's what you should have been doing all along. You should have been looking for the benefit of the other and not for yourself.
Jen says, remember you were aliens in Egypt, care for the aliens among you. Isn't this in Leviticus?
It is in Leviticus, yes. It's also in, I think, Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Something, not that direct quote, but something along those lines. So this picture, I would argue, is Jesus saying that you should do what with your money?
Use it for the benefit of others.
And how does it word in there that makes it feel complicated to us reading it in our century?
God verse one.
What's that?
Either or, God verse one.
Okay, but right before that, I want to get to that point too. But he says, go for you, buy yourself friends, basically. Right? Go be generous with your stuff. So that way you'll be what? Welcome into eternity. Welcomed into the fullness of life. Remember how we talked before about this word of eternity references a sense of fullness of life? And so Jesus is actually saying, God the Master, generous, forgiving, merciful, confronts the manager who is hoarding all of the resources of the master for his own gain. Jesus says, that is not good. You can no longer represent me. Ouch. You no longer represent me. You are no longer able to be my steward. And the steward, about to lose his job, goes out and for the first time maybe behaves in a manner that's closer to the master, that's generous and gives abundantly to the debtors. Are we kind of tracking here? I don't feel like we are.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Why like the specific language of these scenes? Like why, this is interesting to me, that Jesus would be doing this with the Essenes in particular.
Well, Jesus actually kind of backhands the Essenes several times throughout the text because the Essenes believe that they're the only ones that have it right. Stop me any minute now if I start describing something else that you feel familiar with. that they're the only ones that have it right. Anyone who doesn't agree with them is destined for punishment and darkness. And that to be a good steward of God's resources means to sock it away for your own benefit. I think the Essenes are what the church is today.
Do you think there were Essenes present? Like, that's what I'm curious about. Like,
No, they wouldn't have been present. They were in the desert.
so this would have made sense to the audience, though, familiar
course.
with the Essenes,
Yeah, everyone knew these.
and to not go in that direction.
Yeah, Jesus is pointing out here in this moment that, first of all, this is what Jesus is really gifted at. He's gifted at a lot of things, but is that he takes and makes the hero from an unexpected source and makes the bad guy from an unexpected source, right? The Good Samaritan, who's the hero? Samaritan, hated by the Jews. Who's the bad guy? The Levite and the priest who passed the dead, dying man by. They would have been shocked to hear that. In this setting, who is he making the bad guy? If he is indeed referring, which to me, he's using language that we only see in Essene writings. Okay. Later on, Sons of Light is used by Paul in reference to Christians, but it's used very differently. And unrighteous mammon is not used anywhere else. In fact, mammon is not really used anywhere else. And so the scene is very, very much Jesus, in my opinion, saying the Essenes, who you probably perceive as monastic and therefore holy and pious and are out there and they're doing it right. I can tell you right now, they're not doing it right, and that the people in our midst right now, the tax collectors, the sinners, the prostitutes who are generous and take care of their neighbor, are more shrewd and are more like the master than the Sons of Light, who are holed up in the desert, protecting themselves from the darkness of the world.
That's interesting stuff.
Yes.
Dan had a comment on buying friends. He says, in these times, quote, go buy friends, unquote, usually seems to connote that the one buying friends doesn't actually care about the people they're giving to, but here it's quite the opposite.
That's interesting. I don't, anybody have any thoughts about that? I think it's an unfortunate choice of words in our text that kind of implies that they're buying friends. I think it's more so, use your money to care for your neighbors, therefore gain a reputation of generosity that then secures favor. Does that make sense? Which is not nearly as icky as buy friends. Right? So this parable, in my opinion, is once again, Jesus drilling social justice. And this isn't about a spiritual thing. This isn't a spiritual ascent. This is, how is it that you reflect the generosity of the master? Are you the steward who only to save their own ass becomes generous? To make yourself appear good is generous? Or does the generosity begin sooner? And how much more should we be than the steward? Right? I think that this is a really, really powerful teaching from Jesus about equality and fairness, generosity, and almsgiving at the end of the day. What do you guys think?
I have an odd kind of open-ended question.
Sweet. Is this like an open-ended straight draw? Because I know what to do with those. You
Okay.
bet and raise.
Okay, so he's talking to his disciples. And usually so if he was instead telling the same parable to the Pharisees, how would they feel about it? Because usually when he's talking to the Pharisees, he's a little bit putting them in their place. But here he's backhanding these scenes. Would they be like cheering from the sidelines, or they feel like, oh, we should be less like these scenes? Like, how would they interpret it?
Yeah, I think that they're going to identify themselves in it just like we should identify ourselves in it. Like, I think Jesus is picking on a very obvious situation, right? I think within the Pharisaic movement, the steward is very individual. There are some Pharisees who are building up their own good, and then there are others who are being generous and righteous. And we have many stories of teachers in the day of Jesus who would have been part of the Pharisaic party who were like, there's myths or stories about rabbis who would have been Pharisees, right? Walking around the city and they cut holes in the bottoms of their pockets, and as they walked through the cities would drop money for the beggars along the street so as not to embarrass them by handing it to them and make them feel like they were less than and getting a handout, but instead their good fortune, they found money, right? This beautiful picture of, and again, I realize if we wanted to, we could dissect that and try to make it out to the Pharisees being bad and not being willing to stop and give the money. I don't think that's the case when we read the stories.
Can I interrupt you for a moment? It's very much what Jesus teaches, to
Right.
not do your acts of righteousness before people,
Right.
like the hypocrites.
Absolutely.
It's like a literal, that's interesting.
Right. And so here they are, they'd walk around, they would give alms all the time. In fact, it's just, they're famous. The rabbis, the Pharisees became just absolutely notorious for their almsgiving. Some did it for personal accolades, right, which is the Matthew 5 section, standing on the street corner or Matthew 6 rather, standing on the street corner, receiving the praise for doing this. And Jesus says that's not the right way to do it. And I would argue, kind of nailing that with the manager here in a very similar way. So I think the Pharisees hearing this would feel personally convicted. I hope we're personally convicted when we read this. Like, is the only time that I would fall into the category of generous when it's to save my ass. Whether that's an emotional saving of your ass, a spiritual saving of your ass, or a want to look good in front of somebody saving of your ass, whatever it might be, is that when our generosity comes out? Or do we truly represent the master in being generous? Because I think you could argue the reason that the master is not angry is because the master would have always wanted the steward to show that generosity. If that steward truly represented the master to those people, then it should have always been generous. In the same way the master was for not putting him in jail, for not putting him in jail again after he discounts the money and illegally represents himself as still employed, right? That instead the master commends him, right? And I think this is a story about grace and mercy from God, and also a very big call to us to consider what it means to live in a manner that reflects the true heart of grace, mercy, social justice, compassion, empathy of the master. Because whether we like it or not, by having the name Christian represent you, you therefore are like a steward in ancient times who stands before others as a representative of God, right? That's what Jesus kind of gets at in Matthew 25. I was hungry and you fed me, right? That any person is the representative of God. And so I think this passage is, Jesus is saying you can't serve two masters. You can't be squandering, therefore hoarding, or making it all about you, and serve God. Because those two things are mutually exclusive. Does that mean you can't have wealth? No, that's not what's being said. What's being said is you can't be concerned about your own benefit in exclusion of everyone else's. Israel in ancient times, and I would argue probably still through teachings today, imagined that money and resources were for the betterment of the community. That's what their view was. That if I have resources, the resources are so I can take care of my neighbors, right? And that's a very powerful image that Israel wrestled with and did well sometimes and didn't do so well other times. And I would argue, as Christians, as members of the faithful, the same can be said for us. That there are moments that we do really well with the resources we have, and we're generous and we take care of our neighbor. And there are moments when we are not quite so generous. Thoughts, questions? Does that help with the serve two masters piece?
Yeah. I agree that without understanding what mammon is, it's probably a lot harder to make the connection, because I've heard it brought out in a way of people living poor in ministry. So that's where, yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Yes, that would be unhealthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that expectation as well. I've lived that expectation in places that could afford to pay me, but decided not to. So does anyone, when glancing through this story, see anything else that doesn't either fit in what I talked about or troubles you still?
I think the only thing that's troubling me is I don't see due diligence, and I want to see it. Like the reason I said the master could be us is because he's not doing due diligence when he's got a manager that's laundering resources. He's not following up or tracking over short enough time period to see what's happening to all the stuff that he has. But at the same time, I can see it as being God, the provider. So it's just I want to see the due diligence from the top down.
Well, we don't know how long the squandering has been happening. It might be a day, it might be less than 24 hours. The guy went out and bought the Rolex, and God's like, that's me. So there isn't anything that necessitates it. It seems that the rich man does have a grasp of what's going on, even though he doesn't have the books, right? He has to ask them to bring the books to reconcile.
And he could just be asking, you could already know all the details. It
Right.
should be a formality or something,
Yeah.
but
I think one of the clear indicators that the steward is guilty is that he doesn't defend himself at all. Like, that would be shocking. Like, the fact that the steward is silent at first to hear the accusations of the master, that's very fitting with the culture. But the moment he's fired, it's very unfitting to the culture that he doesn't defend himself. And he just accepts his plight. That would have been an unusual turn in the story. Any other thoughts or questions?
and Dan has a comment. He says, "This is good stuff from all of you," and he misses us.
That's reciprocal, Dan. Does anybody want to add anything, ask any questions?
I guess I was just wondering about the next part. Like, Mark asked about how the Pharisees would react. In verse 14, it says, "The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed him. Now I understand him to be Jesus." And so I guess isn't that sort of the Pharisees' response to what was just being said?
Yeah, and I think 15 you could use as a summary of the parable. Like Jesus' interpretation of the parable, which is, you are those who justify yourselves before men, right? Go out, give discounts, right? But God knows your hearts, knows why you gave the discount. It wasn't out of generosity, it was out of self-preservation. For what is exalted above among men is an abomination in the sight of God. So in this situation, he's condemning the Pharisees for their attachment to something that is valued amongst men, and therefore putting it above God. So this would be back to the God versus man thing. The other thing is that we have to realize that this is just a generalization. Not all Pharisees were lovers of money. Because they were Jesus was a Pharisee. Paul says he was a Pharisee. And we want to read in our junk to lovers of money, which they may have loved the money because that meant they could more often put the hole in their pocket and drop and care for the poor ones.
Okay. And I was just curious because it starts off the chapter in, I guess, the parable with Jesus said to his disciples, and then we see the Pharisees heard all this. Does that mean they were his disciples, or they would just?
No, it was just in a public setting. Jesus, we get the impression, spoke to his disciples with the intention that the people around them would hear.
Okay, yeah.
Did he speak really loudly, or did people spread what he was saying to others?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, we still have a sense that he might still be in the meal with the tax collectors and sinners. There's nothing to indicate that they've left that setting. The Pharisees come into the party, crash the party, wag fingers at Jesus. Jesus tells a few parables. And then, if you imagine it's still the same setting, he looks at his disciples and he says, let me tell you a story about shrewd managers, right? And so then he tells this parable. So he indirectly is challenging the Pharisees, who probably would have agreed with him about the Essenes, right? Which is also kind of the powerful thing, is that at first they might be cheering him as he's kind of dropping truth bombs about the Essenes, and then at the end he kind of turns it on them with adding, you can't serve two masters, God and man. So.
And what's mammon? Like, is it just wealth or money, or?
I am going to let you investigate. Any other questions or thoughts? All right. Prayer requests? Yeah, just stop broadcasting, but we can.